Полетели коптеры, полетели сизые, попали по полюшку, ой, да по небу сызнова. Ой, железная ты птица, не понять тебе меня. Все летает над землицей, коптер птица без гнезда. На земле сидел андроид, опустивший голову. Отчего тоскует робот, дат апгрейда нового. Ой, да ты какая система, как с тобой управиться. Тебе ничего не знаем, только нам все нравится. И взлетела робот-птица, лопасти не крутятся. Разрядилась батарея, GPS не грузится. Коптеры летают в небе, токами насыщены. Улетят от нас когда-то, а мы не отыщем их. Полетели коптеры, полетели сизые, попали по полюшку, ой, да по небу сызнова. Он летит на высоте, да на особой частоте. Коптер крыльями шуршит, да и по небу летит. Будто шмель летит жужжащий, слышу радиошумы. Знаем, роботы все сильны. Жаль, что роботы не мы.
It was once said that Russia is an enigma, wrapped in a mystery, wrapped in a riddle. Such a phrase speaks eloquently to the Western sense of Moscow as the other, an inscrutable and menacing land that plays by its own rules. A hard land, with a hard climate and hard people. Despite the countless tragedies they endured throughout the 20th century, every time the Russian state would always return to the world stage to impose its will on Europe again and again. So too it did under the presidency of Vladimir Putin, the president since Yeltsin left office back in 2000.
Я ухожу.
Ever since, Putin reigned with a brief interval for 20 years. It was the year of 2020. Just like the rest of the world, Russia was going through unexpected changes. Internally, Putin was implementing a referendum for constitutional amendments to allow his previous presidential terms to be annulled, allowing him to remain in power until the year of 2036 at the very least. Externally, like the rest of the world, it had to deal with the outbreak of the coronavirus from Wuhan in China. Unlike the rest of Europe, Russia began its own independent research for a vaccine rather than imported from either China or the United States. However, part of this decision was driven by the fact that neither Europe nor the United States would sell their vaccines because of the sanctions imposed on Russia for its claimed annexation of Crimea back in 2014, following the turbulent time in Russia's closest neighbor, Ukraine, colloquially known as the Maidan, which resulted in a pro-Western Ukrainian government in a crisis of separatism in its industrial heartland, the Donbass. In July of 2020, Sergei Furgal was arrested in connection to alleged actions from 2 decades ago. Even though federal authorities expected this to go ahead without any noise, instead, protests demanding Furgal's release erupted. Of particular note in these protests was the leader of the right-wing Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, calling for his supporters to join the protests.
Сегодня утром произошло ЧП, на наш взгляд. Был арестован губернатор Хабаровского края Фургал Сергей Иванович. Ему предъявлено, так сказать, пока еще нет обвинения, оно будет предъявлено позже, но есть информация, что он обвиняется в том, что что-то произошло в 2004 году. Кого-то там убили в Хабаровском крае.
Around the same time, major anti-democratic crackdowns happened in Belarus, allowing for Lukashenko to stay in power, now relying on the military. Trouble also began happening in the world, with fighting sparking between Armenia and Azerbaijani forces in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, and Saudi Arabia falling into civil war. As was the norm for the Russian state, it lent its support for the official government in Riyadh, employing private military contractors to aid them. In early 2021, Navalny tried to return to Russia after his recovery in a German hospital, but upon landing he was almost immediately arrested. In regards to Navalny, this was the last straw, as pro-Navalny protests rocked the Russian Federation, with OMON working around the clock to impose justice with their rubber batons. Changes around the world did not touch just countries of the developing world, as increasing unrest was noticed within America and its society. As far as anyone could tell, tensions in American society have reached a boiling point, with the presidential election expected to become the point of no return. Such assessments turned out to be correct, as in September of 2021, America erupted into its second civil war. This presented many dangers for the world, but also opportunities for countries like China and Russia. Most importantly for Russia, this left NATO countries almost completely defenseless, as American soldiers began evacuating bases in Europe to return home to fight for whatever it is they believed. In what has become the norm for Putin's regime, when expressing condolences to the American people, he could not help but invoke the right-wing 20th century Russian philosopher Ivan Ilyin.
Не хотел бы говорить, что это там Иван Ильин. Только, ну, я читаю Ильина, да, читаю до сих пор. У меня книжка лежит там на полочке. И время от времени снимаю, читаю.
Soon enough, refugees began arriving in Europe and in Russia who were trying to escape the violence that engulfed their home country. The neoliberal order was dying, with the multipolar world struggling to be born. However, not all was well and good for the Russian president. On November the 22nd of 2021, Putin was confirmed to have been COVID-19 positive. Later, it turned out that his condition was made worse by existing chronic conditions. But in his usual character, he refused to back down, continuing to serve as president despite him dying. In Kazakhstan, anti-government protests have escalated into riots, with the Russian government eventually agreeing to Kazakh President Takayev's plea to intervene and restore him to power.
А на войне, как на войне, подруга, вспомни обо мне. А на войне не ровен час, а может мы, а может нас. Комбат, батяня, батяня, комбат.
Despite some minor protests, the pacification of Kazakhstan was successful. Mere weeks after the pacification, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, President of the Russian Federation, passed away from health complications and COVID-19. His place was taken up by the head of government, Mikhail Mishustin, now acting as president and announcing an early election. The three big establishment parties went into overdrive, campaigning to win over the hearts and minds of the people. The candidate who stood out the most, as usual, was Vladimir Wolfovich Zhirinovsky. He masterfully grabbed the attention of the average voter with his eagerness to take up modern tools of agitation, focusing on the youth and sharp-witted ads.
Символом России всегда была русская тройка удалая с бубенцами. А сейчас мы во что превратились? Вот это паршивый маленький ослик, символ нашей страны. Если я стану президентом, у нас вновь появится удалая тройка. Пшел! Еле двигается, идти не может. На месте стоит вся страна. Пшел! Опа! Пшел!
On August 6 of 2022, the votes were counted and the winner was announced. The right-wing LDPR emerged victorious, leaving the centrist United Russia and Soviet nostalgist Communist Party of the Russian Federation as irrelevant and marginalized elements of Russian politics respectively. Now the LDPR was free to implement their neo-imperial vision as they saw fit. As far as EU and NATO geopolitical analysts were concerned, the victory of what essentially was Russian fascism in the election was a geopolitical catastrophe, as the new government will most likely be far more assertive than the centrist Putin ever was. Now that he reigned uncontested, Zhirinovsky made sure to make all citizens aware that his presidency means to implement actual changes. In the first few days after the election, decrees mandating the border be shut down to Central Asian immigration, exclusion of national minorities from local government, and reinstitution of the death penalty were made. This angered certain segments of society. The tipping point was when Zhirinovsky suspended and implemented a new constitution and banned the two other establishment parties in Russian politics. Anti-LDPR resistance groups were formed. But they were quickly dealt with, as Amman became more rabid with dealing with protesters and dissidents. There were two phases to the LDPR. On one hand, there were the more technocratically minded reformists, represented by the more experienced Leonid Slutsky. On the other was the youngest member of the now disbanded State Duma, Vasily Vlasov, who argued for a populist revolution. The ultimate decision was left to the supreme leader to make, siding with Slutsky. Among many other changes, Zhirinovsky gave a much-anticipated speech, in which he proclaimed that he's proclaiming the birth of a new Great Russia, doing away with officialisms like Russian Federation or Russian Empire. Many cities were renamed to their de-Bolshevized variants. Krasnodar was once more Yekaterinodar, Volgograd became Tsaritsyn, and Kaliningrad was renamed to its old Polish-style name of Korolevets. In accordance with its new nationalistic stance, the Russian state dedicated some resources to adding fuel to the fire of the American Civil War. The intention of this policy was to keep America burning, so to say, to make sure that it could never rise again, to rival Great Russia and keep the war going for as long as possible. This policy became much more debilitating for America when Viktor Bout escaped and returned to Russia and joined the LDPR government. Very quickly, Zhirinovsky began implementing his conception of a pragmatic economic policy. In essence, what this meant was that he was reorientating Russia's economic relations from a West-East dynamic to a North-South one. Another aspect of his economic policy was the militarization of the state, economy, and society. An empire cannot be restored with kisses and hugs. In June of 2024, Great Russia finally began implementing its conception of foreign policy into reality. The first to fall was, ironically, Russia's most loyal ally, Lukashenko. He was replaced with a staunchly Russophilic government, beginning the early stages of implementing a reinterpreted version of the Union State. At the same time, the last nail was hammered into the new liberal order's coffin in the Balkans. In November, Russian diplomats informed the leaders of Central Asian states that they had only two options: either become part of Great Russia or feel the might of Russian steel and fire. All but two saw reason. Despite the success of the expedition into Central Asia, the few military engagements show that the Russian army has many problems, primarily in firepower and the number of troops. Being few in numbers made Russian units unable to take on fortified or urban positions on their own. This meant that despite Gerasimov's arguments, Zhirinovsky decided on developing a modernized conception of the deep battle doctrine, with its emphasis on firepower and numbers. That July, an ultimatum was issued to the leadership of Caucasian states. Just like with Central Asia, all submitted without a fight. Zhirinovsky could now focus all his attention on planning a similar operation in Ukraine. For a long time now, there were rumors circulating both in Ukraine itself and Russia that since Ukraine left the Minsk protocols, there will be renewed fighting in the Donbass. Zhirinovsky's ministers warned that this act of aggression will make NATO countries feel like Russia is trying to corner them, and as is well known, a cornered animal is extremely dangerous, as it has no choice but to lash out. This required much more thorough preparation than what was initially assumed would be needed. By February of 2027, a plan was formulated. When Russian troops crossed the Ukrainian border, aided by Donbass and Pridnestrovyan militias, Ukraine will be quickly occupied and incorporated into Great Russia, while troops on the frontiers bordering NATO will hold the line. Then, when Ukraine is done with, Russian divisions will rapidly occupy the Baltics, after which the Russian army will proceed to move into the Balkans. This was assumed to be the point at which NATO will have to see reason and agree to peace on Russia's terms at any cost. At 2 AM on the 20th of September of 2027, in a televised address to the nation, Zhirinovsky announced a special military operation with the aim of liberating Ukraine from both Nazism and liberalism and to reincorporate Ukrainians into Great Russia, as they were only Russians who have gone astray, with the Russian army having been ordered to cross the border.
Засекли врага!
The reforms to the army quickly yielded visible results as Kiev was taken without a fight. But, as predicted, NATO did not just sit and watch. NATO announced an operation to support Ukrainian independence against the Russian war of aggression.
Заряжает ракету. Наша шхуна идет на таран. Пироман, пироман, пионер, пионер. По программе акция, значит я акционер. Мы сегодня ночью будем накрывать бандер. Ура, ураган, выступает русский хулиган. Ра-та-та-та-та. Каждый стержневой, как терминатор. Бара-бара-бан, заряжает мили-великан. Брат за брата-та, вся торсина вышла на регату. Испаньола уходит в вояж. В небо флаг воскресения мертвых. А под флагом ее экипаж. Самый лютый, самый упертый. Кто формат, тот тут первый фанат. Кто последний герой.
In October, Ukraine had fallen, with Azov leadership being put on trial, most being sentenced to the highest measure of punishment. Thus, Russia's first stage of the war plan was completed. It was now time to commit to Operation Wrangel. In November of 2027, a citizen named Gavril Doroshin decided to volunteer to join the army in order to join the fighting. He was a descendant of the last Russian Emperor, Nicholas II, through the female line of succession. Despite the concerns of some within army leadership, his request was accepted.
А в Бахмуте цветут цветы, их укрывает белым снегом. Летят осадки с высоты, заброшенные человеком. Здесь мысли главные о том, чтоб градом не побило стебли.
Despite all efforts of the Russian garrison in Korolovets, the oblast fell to the constant onslaught of NATO hordes.
Февраль, весна не за горами, здесь гиацинты и тюльпаны. И хоть июнь еще не с нами, стоят пионы на охране. Нам птицы не поют красиво, а лишь шуршат над головами. Идем вперед под звуки взрывов, вперед с победой и цветами. Нам не страшны ни грязь, ни снег, удобство здесь лишь под ногами. Бежит поляк, хохол и грек, оставив леопардов с нами. В кустах врага лягушки ждут, пантерам башню разрывают. Гвоздики в пустыне, укронацисты отступают. Февраль, весна не за горами, здесь гиацинты и тюльпаны. И хоть июнь еще не с нами, стоят пионы на охране. Нам птицы не поют красиво, а лишь шуршат над головами. Идем вперед под звуки взрыва, вперед с победой и цветами. У Марьинки цветы цветут, и слышен грохот от акаций. А за спиной кинжалы ждут национальных провокаций. Торчат стволы среди руин, и бум с крыльями летают. Кипит в крови адреналин, и в час свободы застывает. Февраль, весна за горами. Здесь гиацинты и тюльпаны. И хоть июнь еще не с нами, стоят пионы на охране. Там птицы не поют красиво, а лишь шуршат над головами. Идем вперед под звуки взрыва, вперед с победой и цветами.
Уничтожен.
By February of 2028, with the liberation of Korolovets, the Russian army was ready to execute the third stage of the war plan. With the fall of Romania, Bulgaria, and even beginning an incursion into Greece, the rapid progress of the Russian army spoke to the Greek and Turkish governments into agreeing to a white peace with the Russian state. This freed up the Russian army to complete one final dash for victory in the war.
За дело, ребята.
По нам стреляют!
Девушкам сегодня грустно, мы говорим. Полюшка широко поет, едут по полю герои, это русские герои.
On August 10th, seeing how the Russian army was steamrolling across the European plain deep into NATO territory, the West Europeans, as expected, begged for peace on any conditions with Great Russia. Russia emerged victorious in its toughest battle yet, and not only that, but it also was able to restore the border of the old empire. Despite the great victory over the liberal West, acquiring so many territories in just under a year caused serious issues with actually governing those territories. As well as that, problems were caused in the recovering economy and in society, with violence being brought home by PTSD-ridden veterans of the European War. In August of 2028, Vladimir Zhirinovsky passed away.
Да, Владимирович, мы все сделаем. Очень много телеграмм поступило в эту больницу. Я сперва отказался их читать, боялся, что расстроишь. Но там они все оптимистические. Поэтому пусть мой блог передастся мне. Они здесь, Владимирович, они здесь. Я могу читать, они здесь. Хорошо. И, Василий, посмотри, что по стране. Активисты ЛДПР предложили пикеты. 2-3 человека. Желаем скорейшего выздоровления. Мы уже давно по всей стране ждем вашего возвращения. Наверное, 1000 видеообращений. Все очень-очень сильно ждут вас. Постоянно меня спрашивают.
The fate of the party, and with it, the state, was at a crossroads. Despite years of consolidating control over government institutions, the faltering popularity of the LDPR did not let Leonid Slutsky come out as the victor of a debate held later that year. The debate was won by the growing monarchist faction of the party. As many have said for years, without Zhirinovsky, the LDPR was nothing but a small splash in the pond of Russian politics. Now that it was determined that Russia is going to be once again a monarchy, it was a matter of choosing the sovereign. The choice was obvious. It was going to be the man who was there with the people, with the soldiers in the trenches. He was with them both in victory and in loss. Gavril, now under his regal name Nicholas III. After 400 years, the Zemsky Sobor assembled to crown Russia's first monarch in over 100 years. The LDPR fell into obscurity. The first challenge faced by the Soldier King was governing the new territories and facing terrorist activity within Russia proper itself. Neo-Bolshevik and Islamist groups throughout the empire have sprung up to fight against the restored empire. The army and OMON were given a blank check to engage with these threats. The old neoliberal world was finally dead. Only Asia and a few third world countries still maintained any kind of system of international law and a United Nations. As for Europe and North America, there was no more international law. And with that, it meant that there was no such thing as the ICC or the Geneva Convention mandating how to treat enemies of the state and His Imperial Majesty. As for Europe itself, France, Germany and Spain fell into violent civil wars, with all kinds of leftist governments coming to power. Despite taking a hard stance on terrorists and separatists, Nicholas III decided that turning back the clock on Russia back to orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality would be foolish. Absolutism was a thing of the past, and attempts to hold on to it was part of the reason why the old empire eventually fell. Plus, he himself had experienced war and many personal losses of comrades at the front, being able to learn what actually concerns the regular Russian people. Taking this into consideration, democratization in Russia was inevitable. Therefore, it was decided to reinstate the October Manifesto, turning back the clock only to 1905 rather than 1721. Despite some doubts as to his historic mission, Nicholas was determined to fight for his subjects' right to have a voice in politics and for more minority representation in local and national government, as he wished to reward the peoples of Russia who too have fought side by side with the Russians in the European War. But in Europe, the communists were not idling, but instead they were remilitarizing, rebuilding. It was obvious to everyone that there would be a second war. To secure Russia's flanks in the north and the south, it was decided to execute special operations against Turkey and Finland, which were both over within mere weeks at most. In May of 2032, it became known to Russian agents that the Internationale was preparing to go to war against Russia and her allies. Some preparations were being made to defend Hungary, Slovakia, and the Russian Poland. And so, on the 21st of May of 2032, the National People's Army crossed the border of the remaining Polish state, marking the beginning of the Second European War. communist offensive was halted by October. Seeing how the war is taking on a static character, the Internationale gave the signal for communist insurgencies in Ukraine, Belarus and the Baltics to start uprisings. All but the Baltics were now infiltrated by the communists. But beyond western Ukraine and Belarus, the Reds did not break through any further, allowing Russia time to prepare a counteroffensive. Despite the desperate fighting by the communists, by August of 2033, the Imperial army fought its way to the pre-war Polish border. Eventually, the Russian army began its full-scale invasion of Western Europe.
тяжелый танк.
April 12th, 2034. All enemies have fallen before the feet of the Russian warriors. The war in Europe was finally over. But this time, it was different. After this war, there was no country left in Europe that could ever again threaten Russia and her hegemony. After millions of losses from both sides, the war was over. Pax Russica was made manifest. The Russian fatherland emerged as the winner of yet another patriotic war. Even though now it was no surprise to anyone, but many still couldn't fully believe that they and their country actually managed to emerge out of this war alive, and their country as a global superpower. 4 major European cities were nuked: Warsaw, Budapest, Berlin, and Paris. Russia and the rest of Europe had a lot of recovering, rebuilding, and reconciling to do. Many of the conquered peoples all over Europe still held hatred in their hearts for Russia and Russians after all the loss and destruction they had to witness and endure. But just like the Russians after the First European War, Europe's peoples have suffered too much to want another war. The First War significantly de-radicalized Russia politically. Many experts now predict that the same process of de-radicalization will happen in Western Europe. Emperor Nicholas and his loyal subjects could now rejoice, for Russia may finally find the 20 years of peace which it so desperately needed, just as Stolypin would have wanted. For some decades to come, Europe can now count on a truly long peace, now under the protection of the Russian Eagle.
Это Родина моя, и делить ее нельзя. Это матушка Россия, это русская земля. Это Родина моя, и делить ее нельзя. Это матушка Россия, это русская